everyone, welcome back to a new video. Today I will be going over all the books that I read throughout the month of May. So it has been a while since I uploaded. I did post on the community tab that I haven't been doing the best with my health, and I don't want to go into too many details just because everything related to that is a little bit complicated. May was rough, to say the least. I needed to take a break from filming and uploading. I did upload my bookshelf tour, but then after that it was just, things were rough. So I decided to take a break, much needed. But even in the midst of not feeling great, there are definitely blessings because I've had a lot more time to read. Needless to say, I spent a lot of time resting this month, so I read a lot and I already blabbered too much. So let's just get going with this wrap up. I also don't know if I'll be able to film this entire video right now. So I may film part of the wrap up right now, and then you may see me from another day filming the rest of the wrap up, but we'll see what happens. We'll see how long this ends up taking. With the books that I rated above a 4-star, I definitely have more to say about those books, but the books that I rated less than 4 stars, I will try to be more brief and concise as possible. Those of you who have been around for a while know that brief and concise is not something I'm good at. So let's see how I actually do with that today. But first, I just want to share the books that I read for the Southern Charm Readathon. So I'll just quickly mention what they are. And I do have the graphic that I filled out, and I shared this on Instagram when I had finished. So for the Bless Your Heart, Hot as Blue Blazes, and Hey Y'all prompts, I read The Hidden Prince by Tessa Afshar. For the Sweet Tea prompt, I read Deerbrook by Harriet Martineau. For Heavens to Betsy, I read Peril at End House. For all the fixins and also the free space, I used A Note Yet Unsung. And then for Chicken and Dumplings, I read At Home in Mitford, and for Howdy Partner, I read Wishtress. So those were the books that I read for the Southern Charm Readathon that I co-hosted with Amanda and a few other ladies, and I will have all of their channels linked below for you to check them out. All right, so I just want to quickly rapid fire the DNFs from this month. 3 of them I've already unhauled, so I don't have them physically here. First off, we have Where the Road Bends by Rachel Fordham. This one was just a case of I wasn't the fan of the dialogue and the writing style, and it just wasn't for me. So that was a DNF, as well as The Alice Network. And I've just come to the conclusion that Kate Quinn is not for me. This was my 3rd book by her that I had tried. I read one of her books from start to finish and overall enjoyed it, but even then I wasn't the biggest fan of her writing. And then I DNF'd another one by her, and this is my 2nd DNF by her, my 3rd attempt at one of her books, and I just don't think Kate Quinn is for me. I also DNF'd Our Woman in Moscow by Beatrice Williams. This one was also a case of the writing style and unlikable characters, and I also heard that there are quite a few sex scenes in this book, so no thank you. And then finally, Lessons in Chemistry. This one just felt like a book with ideals and social issues and stuff from 2023 plopped into the 1960s. The main character was extremely unlikable, lives on a high horse. I couldn't. All right, so like I said, I read a lot in May. I'm going to do my absolute best to be concise. I believe there are 27 items, I'll say, stories to talk about. Quite a few of them are on the shorter side. One of them is a Shakespeare play. One of them is a poem that literally I read in one sitting. One of them I started back in February and finished in May. A couple of them I started in April and finished in May, but there are still just a lot of stories to talk about, so let's just get cracking. All right, so going from my very least favorite book all the way up to my favorite. My least favorite book of the month, I unfortunately gave a 2.5 to 2.75. I rounded it up to 3 on Goodreads, but it's more of a 2.75. And that book, unfortunately, was In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. This is one of the first true crime novels written, and it tells the true story of the Clutter family murders from the 50s and how the killers were brought to justice. I read this because I personally love true crime, but mainly in documentary form. And so I went into this with really, really high expectations just because it is a classic within the genre, within true crime, within nonfiction. But thinking about the context surrounding the book, I think it's pretty amazing as a book and as a nonfiction. It's just not for me, and it's not one I particularly enjoyed reading. I found the subject material to be interesting, but I would rather watch it, you know, in documentary form than read it physically. I just found it to be dry in the written form, but that's just me. All right, moving on to the 3-star books. We have George Bernard Shaw's plays. So there are 4 plays in here, 2 of which I did not care for all that much, 2 of which I did enjoy. So the 2 that I overall enjoyed are Mrs. Warren's Profession and Pygmalion. Mrs. Warren's Profession was definitely more of a, you know, modern young woman going against the ideal standards of Victorian womanhood type of story, but it had an interesting mother-daughter relationship, and the mother owns a ton of brothels and the daughter just, you know, is coming to terms with that and really doesn't appreciate what her mother does, and so she's working through her anger. But I didn't like the ending of the play. I don't like where it went. And I heard that initially the play was actually banned in England, which I found funny, but so that was Mrs. Warren's Profession. And then Pygmalion was the second play that I really enjoyed. That one I would highly recommend. Basically, that one is about language and identity, as the star of the play is this lower class woman, and she wants to work in a shop. She wants to better herself. She wants to have a respectable job and so on. And she ends up meeting these men, and one of them is a professor of phonetics, and he just has this very, very strong understanding of language and accents and how language plays a role in society as a whole. And so he's able to teach her how to speak like a lady rather than like a lower class English, like country girl. After I read the play, I watched an adaptation, and it was on YouTube, so I'll look for it and link it below if I can find it. It was almost identical in terms of like the script and everything. I definitely recommend Pygmalion. It was very, very fun. Next up, we have Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. This is a futuristic dystopian classic, so it was written in the 50s. And basically it's in this world where firemen don't put fires out, but rather they start them. And they basically burn books, and they also burn down homes of people who have hidden books and have tried to hide that from like authorities and things like that. Our main character, Guy Montag, he is one of these firemen, and he does his job. He finds pleasure in burning things, and one day he ends up meeting this young girl, and they just start talking, and she starts saying these things that kind of make him feel uncomfortable, but they're things that are just normal, like normal conversation, and he just kind of starts to have his preconceived notions about society and societal structures challenged in a way that makes him feel very uncomfortable. And, you know, things start happening in his brain, and the story kind of goes from there. I thought it was interesting. I thought the themes were interesting. I think it's an interesting book to discuss with other people. If I had read it and then had people to talk to about it, you know, I'd glean more out of it. But I don't think it would change my rating of the book, because I rate based on how I enjoyed the book. My personal enjoyment of it was like a 3-star. Next up, we have a book that I thought I would give 5 stars to, and unfortunately it was a 3-star read, and that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries by Heather Fawcett. So I went into this with very high expectations. It's about this woman named Emily who studies fairies, and she's putting together this encyclopedia. She is in a fictional country that very much reminded me of like Iceland, Finland, I don't know, very Nordic, and she's studying fairies and this very sinister kind of fae presence in this village that she is staying in while she's studying. She doesn't quite fit in with the locals. They don't seem to like her all that much. She also has a colleague who joins her, and he may not be who he says he is, and there's just a lot of like mystery and intrigue and this eeriness to just everything that's going on. So there are all these elements that made me think this will be at least 4 stars, if not 5, but I found the story so lackluster and not nearly as engaging as I was hoping it would be. And it's supposed to have an enemies to lovers trope, which is one of my favorite things, but even then it didn't really capture my interest, my heart, I don't know. You know what I'm trying to say. There's just so many buzzwords and things that make me love a book, including the fact that this is epistolary, so it's all told in diary entries. It just didn't work for me. There are also footnotes at the bottom of a lot of the pages, and it made this feel like an encyclopedia, and that also really took me out of the story, so it was almost too academic and less whimsical than I was hoping it would be. All right, this next book. So I didn't rate this book, and I'm just gonna talk about it now here in the 3-star region, even though I didn't rate it because I still don't know what I would rate it. Anyways, that book is beach read. So I loved the things that I loved about it, okay? The things that I loved about it were great. The things that I didn't love, though, I really, really didn't love. So brief nutshell, we have Guy, Gus, we have girl, January. Both are authors, both are living in summer houses, both have stuff in their past that they're working through, very believable things, real hard things. They're polar opposites, and so to try something new, they swap writing projects. But obviously sparks fly because they have to, because it's a romance book. Okay, so I didn't rate this again because I still don't know what I would rate it. So I read this because I was in the mood for a contemporary summery romance, which never happens because those of you who follow my channel know I don't like contemporary. And I had also heard that this book was perfect for book lovers, which is true. I can attest to that. Okay, so the things I loved, the writing, and I believe this might be a debut. I could totally be wrong, but I think this was a debut. The writing was so good. Like, I really, really liked the writing. It was great. It was realistic. The story felt so natural and very, very authentic, and the characters and their problems felt authentic. There was just a lot more depth than I was expecting from a contemporary romance with a lot of smut, which leads me on to what I really hated. I have boundaries. This book crossed them. I'm not the type of reader that's like, oh, there was an open door scene in that book, you know, straight in the garbage. I'm done. I have a book here that I read and very much enjoyed, and it had a scene that I wish wasn't there, but it's how it's written for me personally. I have my own boundaries. I know my own boundaries. This book crossed them multiple times. And because of that, I am very, very indecisive as to how I feel and whether or not I will continue reading Emily Henry's books. I might not. I don't know. It is a really good book. If any of you know of authors that write wonderfully, like wonderfully beautiful writing, contemporary romance with mature older people that have real problems, I need the real deal. Things that are real, that feel real. Moving on. Next up, we have The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel. So 3 stars. Okay. I read Station 11 by her. One of my favorite books. I gave that book 5 stars. I loved it. I really want to reread it. And this book gave me expectations that were not met because the back of it makes it feel like it's going to deliver something that it does not deliver. So I would highly recommend, if you are planning on reading this book, don't read the back. So the surface level of this book is this disappearance that happens off of a ship, which you should not know anything more than that, and a crime. It's a financial crime that happens around the stock market crash, and that's really all you should know. I just feel like this book was trying to tackle way too much, and it just didn't really work for me. There is a brother and sister, and I feel like if the book had focused a lot more on their relationship, I would have connected emotionally much deeper to the story, but alas, it did not. There were many layers, but like as the peels were being peeled back, I wasn't amazed or anything. I was just left more confused. But I still love her writing. She creates a mood. Like, her writing feels at first very straightforward, but there's a mood. She creates this ambience, and I can't really put my finger on what it is because it's not really melancholy. Like, it's different. She's different. She's very unique. Anyways, I'm glad I read this because I need to read Sea of Tranquility, and I have been told to read this and Station 11 before Sea of Tranquility to get the most out of that book. So still happy that I read this. All right, then I have a couple 3-star mysteries here. I'm going to try to talk about them as fast as I can. First up is Murder on the Flying Scotsman. This is, I believe, book 4, I think, in the Daisy Dalrymple mystery series. And in this one, Daisy, our main character, is on a train going from England up to Scotland, and she meets this family, and they have this wealthy uncle who is very, very old. He has a lot of money, and so they're just like, who's gonna inherit? They're just waiting for him to read his will. They're on their way to a will reading of his brother, and basically there's just a lot of money, and they all want it. And this uncle dies on the train. He's murdered. And of course Daisy figures out who it is because it's Daisy. And also her lovely inspector friend, Alec, who is dreamy and they're so cute together. So, and like it says on the back of this book, fans of Downton Abbey will be delighted. Would highly recommend the Daisy Dalrymple series if you need a very easy, doesn't require many brain cells, just quick read. I literally said I'd be quick. Am I being quick? Not really. Okay, good series. Then we got an Agatha Christie. I gave 3 stars to Cards on the Table. This is a Poirot mystery. And this one, we have a very interesting setup. We have a dinner party. This really weird guy invites Poirot, Ariadne Oliver, Superintendent Battle, and then, oh, I forgot the other guy, Colonel something. Anyways, they are invited, them 4. And then another 4 guests are invited. And so the person who invited everyone, he ends up murdered. And so we have 4 people who are all basically detectives in a way. We have Poirot, Ariadne Oliver, the superintendent, and this other dude. And then we have 4 suspects, and they were playing a card game, and the card game is kind of used to like figure out what happened. If I knew how to play the game, maybe I would have enjoyed this book more, but I knew nothing about the game, so I was very confused. So I just found myself a little bored and uninvested, but I really did like the setup of like 4 sleuths and 4 suspects. Found that very fun, so 3 stars. Then we have 2 Ella Montgomery stories. So the first one's actually a collection of short stories, and that is the Chronicles of Avonlea. So this is just a collection of short stories set around the time that Anne is a child, but she isn't a main character, although she does kind of pop up here and there. Overall, the stories were very sweet. There were definitely a few gems out there, and my 3 favorite, if you were interested and would like to read them, they're probably all free online. The 3 are The Hurrying of Ludovic, The Winning of Lucinda, and Little Jocelyn. So those were my 3 favorite from this little collection. So it was 3.5 stars. Some of the stories I found endearing, some of them were a little meh, but not once did Ella Montgomery's writing disappoint. She's the best. Then we have The Story Girl, and this one I gave 3.5 to 3.75 stars. This one started off a little bit rough. I didn't enjoy it so much at the beginning, but by the end I was definitely a lot more attached to the characters. So this one is about a group of young cousins, and they befriend this other group of kids, and they're all just constantly hanging out, having fun, making the most of their time together, and they befriend a girl named Sarah Stanley, and she is known as the Story Girl because she tells great stories. And so the majority of this book is just these kids getting up to various shenanigans and having a great time, and then listening to Sarah's stories. Once I passed the halfway point, I definitely started feeling a deeper connection to the kids, and there were some hilarious moments with these kids, like laugh out loud funny. There was one scene, actually, it was one of my favorites, where the local newspaper printed an article that the Judgment Day was coming, and they said what day it was, and the kids believed that it was real, and so they started to prepare. They were like, making clothes for themselves, and they literally thought that like Jesus was coming, and they were so scared and so, emotionally distressed. And the adults were just like laughing behind their back without the kids realizing. And it was the most endearing chapter out of the entire book. Like just that chapter, it was hilarious just to read it. The way it was written, the way Ella Montgomery captured the childlike fear and innocence in that kind of a scenario, it was hilarious. So yeah, I'm really glad I read this. It wasn't amazing, but overall very enjoyable. Next up is a historical romantic thriller, if you will, and that is The Black Swan of Paris by Karen Robards, and this one I gave 3.5 stars to. So this book is about a French singer named Genevieve, and she's also become, I guess, a reluctant resistance member. She didn't initially want to be part of the resistance, but she was kind of betrayed into being part of it in a way. It's kind of hard to explain without giving spoilers, but she is part of the resistance now, and even though she didn't initially join it, voluntarily, she can't really do anything about it. Her reluctance really does lessen though when she finds out that her mother was actually arrested by the Gestapo, and she does everything in her power with the help of her, I guess he's her agent. They do their absolute best to try to save her mother, and they use like her status as a singer and her privilege and everything to continue working for the resistance, and it definitely works to their advantage. So although this is historical fiction, the romance was a lot heavier than I was expecting it to be, and for that reason, it wasn't, higher than like a 4-star. At times it was cheesy, and the story itself was quite predictable, but it scratched an itch. At the time, I was really craving a book like this, and this was perfect for that craving. And every time I put it down, I wanted to pick it back up, so it was just one of those books that You don't expect much from it, but you just voraciously read it because you're in the mood for it, and it delivered what I wanted, and that's totally fine. So it did have one open door scene, if I recall, although the way it was written, I think it was better done than a lot of romance books are, but I could have done without it for sure, but just wanted to mention that. All right, the rest of the books were all 4 stars or higher, which is amazing. I had such a great reading month in terms of quality, and it really, really makes me very happy. But the next 3 books, I am just gonna quickly go through them. I don't have much to say about them. This first one here was nonfiction, which is not really my thing, but this was very special for me. And that is Growing Strong by Cambria Joy. This is workouts, devotions, and recipes to become healthy from the inside out. This is exactly what I needed, and I will keep coming back to this book. I've tabbed it up like this. I don't tab things, I never annotate, but this was just exactly what I needed, and this was just awesome. All right, next 4-star is Animal Farm by George Orwell. I had read this in high school. All I remembered about it was that it's kind of symbolic of the 1917 revolution in Russia. Wow, I really enjoyed my reread of this, and I really, really wish I knew more about the Russian Revolution. I wish I knew more about Stalin and all the other, men that these animals symbolize and everything. Just like in terms of the writing, it's not really my jam, but in terms of the themes, I love the themes discussed. So definitely one that I will reread multiple times. All right, next up is Romeo and Juliet. And this is one that I read in high school, but besides the ending, I didn't remember anything about it. And I had a lot of fun reading it. I gave this one 4 stars. I thought it was really, really funny, actually. I was surprised at how funny it was. A lot of the characters in this play were hilarious, and I love reading a Shakespeare play and then watching an adaptation, or better yet, while I'm reading it, having the play playing, if I can find a really good version of it on YouTube. And yeah, I had such a great time with this. Would highly recommend, and I would honestly recommend No Fear Shakespeare. Best thing ever, because on one side you have the traditional Shakespeare and then you have modern English. It's perfect. No other thoughts other than this was a really stupid play, but really, really funny. All right, then we have a huge chunky classic, and this one I read for the Read Your Bookshelf Challenge that Chantel hosts, and that is David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. I started this in February, and then by the time May rolled around, it just fit the prompt for the Read Your Bookshelf Challenge perfectly. And May's was to read a book with more pages than the previous book, and I forget what last month's was, but this book is huge. 100% it has more pages than last month's pick. But yeah, started this in February. It took me forever to read this book. And it's not to say I wasn't enjoying it. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was really good, and actually this book has some of my favorite characters out of all the Dickens books that I've read. So this is a coming-of-age story that is inspired by Dickens' own personal life. It tells the story of David Copperfield and how he had a pretty difficult childhood, how he grew up, and how he made the most of all that life threw him, and how basically what he went through throughout his life shaped him as an adult. Basically. Like I said, the characters were absolutely wonderful. We have James Steerforth, Traddles, Betsy Trotwood was hilarious, Uriah Heep was awful. We have Dora, Agnes, honestly, some of the best characters ever. The writing was wonderful, the characters were wonderful, but I just didn't like David. I just felt like, I don't know how to describe him as a character, but reading this book, I felt like I was watching everything happen and David was just standing there. He would walk from point A to point B, things would happen, and then he'd just be like, I just felt like he never had agency over his own life, and he was kind of dumb at times. He experienced enough where I feel like he should have matured a lot more than he did. But it was still a really good book, and the ending was really sweet, so I gave it 4 stars. All right, and next up we have Book of a Thousand Days. This one is an Asian-inspired fantasy, and it's basically a retelling of one of the Grimm's fairy tales. It very much felt like a more somber Disney movie. And this is a case where a love triangle was done really, really well. And so we have Dashti, and she is a maid. She is with her mistress, basically, in this medieval land. Her mistress, Lady Saren, has refused to marry the man that her father told her to marry, commanded her to marry, and so they are locked away in this tower. And the most beautiful of bonds form, and things happen. the plot really takes off, and it's truly a beautiful story. Would highly recommend. All right, so this is me from the next morning, and I'm ready to continue talking books after I've had roughly half of this mug of coffee. So next up we have Wishtress by Nadine Brandes, and this is a fantasy that's a Christian allegory. So it's written by a Christian author, and she imbued a lot of what it means to be a Christian in this book without it being so explicitly portrayed. But what this book is about, we have a girl named Mirth, and she has this talent, and many people in this world, in this fantasy world, have what are called talents, and they give you different magical abilities that originate from this well, and hers is the ability to use her tears to grant wishes. But something goes wrong, and the next tear that she sheds will be the death of her. It will kill her. She finds out that she is indeed this Wishtress, which is a very special person with this ability that pops up every now and again, and the king is trying to kill her. He is trying to rid the land of talents and allow only banes to exist, which is like another type of talent but far more destructive. And so there's very much this battle of good versus evil in this book. And then we have another main character named Bastien, and he also has a talent where he can stop time at the snap of his fingers, and he can go and continue doing things while time has stopped. That also has repercussions, and so he's dealing with that. Bastien and Mirth end up crossing paths, and he promises to take her to the well so that her curse can be broken. And so they start on this journey, and the majority of this book is their adventure on their way to the well. I felt very similarly about this book as I did towards her other book, Fox, in that I loved the fantasy elements and I loved what she did with the world and her creativity, but I really struggled to connect to the characters. I was very intrigued by the plot and where the story was headed, but again, the characters, I just felt like I couldn't really connect to them. With the exception of Bastien, I think Nadine is a very talented writer, and I definitely want to continue to read her books as they come out. I really, really enjoy the worlds that she creates and just seeing her creativity on the page. I also believe this book is inspired by the Netherlands. There were many little tidbits that made it feel very Dutch. Not sure if the words used were outright Dutch, but definitely Netherlands inspiration. Anyways, I very much enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars and I would recommend. Next up, we have Peril at End House by Agatha Christie. This is a Poirot mystery in which Poirot meets a woman who seems to have all these accidents happening, and she just keeps escaping death, and Poirot is very suspicious and decides that he has to figure out what's going on. And I was very happy to see that Hastings is in this one. Hastings is not in very many Poirot books that I've read, and I really, really like Hastings. So it was nice to see him in this one and just watch Poirot as he discovers things. And this one is also set on the Cornish coast during the summertime, so it was a perfect time of year to read it. Even though I did guess part of the ending, it was still a great twist. And man, Poirot is so arrogant, but I still love him so much. He is hilarious. He really cracks me up. But Peril at End House, this was very, very fun. And I would say it's probably one of my favorites out of all the Poirot stories. So very much enjoyed this. Next up, we have Royal Flush. This is the 3rd book in the Royal Spinous mystery series, and so far my favorite. I really, really enjoyed this one, and I love when I give cozy mysteries higher than a 3-star. This was definitely a 4-star read for me. I loved this. It was so fun, and this one's actually set in Scotland, so I love books set in Scotland. I'm a sucker for that. And in this one, we have our main character, Georgie, who is related to the King and Queen of England. And this is set during the 30s. So she is very far down the line of heirs to the throne. But she doesn't have money. Her family doesn't have money. And so she does what she can to make ends meet. And in this book, she ends up being tasked with keeping an eye on Wallis Simpson, which, if you don't know anything about Wallis Simpson and her shenanigans with the King and Queen's son, David, that's a whole history, but very fun. And then she is also tasked by Scotland Yard to just keep an eye on things in Scotland where they are at the Balmoral Palace, because it seems like someone is trying to kill off the heirs to the throne. And there's just so much more to the story. Very interesting side characters. I really love how this wasn't the typical cozy mystery formula in the sense of like, a murder happens and then you have this amateur sleuth who is, trying to figure things out, and then things are figured out and it's all vibes and whatever. This one had a lot of different things happening at once, but they all just kind of came together. And Georgie's friend Belinda is very promiscuous and constantly like jokes in a sexual way. and kind of not pressures, but almost pressures Georgie into, you know, cheapening romance and relationships and things like that. Georgie really stands her ground. In the second book in the series, all the jokes that Belinda would say and just everything that she would talk about usually was very sexual, and it really bothered me, but I appreciate that Georgie as a main character is not about that, and she's very much like, no, I'm not going to follow in your footsteps and live my life the way you are, Belinda. And yeah, I really enjoyed that. We also have At Home in Mitford by Jan Karen, and this one is kind of hard to summarize because it's one of the most slice of life books I've ever read, if not the most slice of life story. It's just about a town in North Carolina, a fictional town, and the people in the 90s. I think it's in the 90s. Could totally be wrong, but I believe it's in the 90s. And a bachelor rector who is in his late 50s, early 60s, named Father Tim, and his relationships with everyone, his friendships with everyone, the hardships he faces, the joys, the pains, literally slice of life. But honestly, one of the most heartwarming stories I have ever read, and I'm so glad that I read it. It wasn't quite 5 stars for me. I did struggle to get into it, and depending on my reading mood, sometimes I do need a faster moving plot, and this one was quite slow. But honestly, as over-romanticized as this book is, as it over-romanticizes, I guess, small town living, I don't even care. It was precious, and just seeing all these characters, some of them were spitfires, some of them were just hilarious. This book was definitely what the doctor ordered. I really needed it, and I'm so glad that I read it. And I have one more 4-star book, but I'm actually going to talk about it with one of the 5-star books because they are books 2 and 3 in a trilogy. So I will talk about those together. But the book is A Beauty So Rare by Tamara Alexander, and the 5-star book is A Note Yet Unsung, so I will talk about these together in just a minute. But moving on to my 4.5 and 5 stars, I'm kind of grouping them all together because to me, 4.5 stars is like, it was so close. It was so close. It was just the one tiny little thing. One tiny thing that I can't quite give it 5 stars. But first we have the poem that I read, and that is The Lady of Shalott by Tennyson. And I read this for Montgomery, and I forgot to mention that the other 2 Ella Montgomery books I read, I didn't read them initially because of Montgomery, which was the readathon going on to celebrate Ella Montgomery. But it just so happened that it was Montgomery and it worked out perfectly. And so I read this poem and then realized that I think one of the prompts of the readathon was to read a poem that's mentioned by Anne or something along those lines. But The Lady of Shalott is very much an Arthurian romantic poem, and it is one of the most beautiful poems I have ever read, and I really find poetry hit or miss for me. I can see why Anne Shirley adores this poem. I adored it and I gave it 5 stars, and I love that it's inspired by Arthurian legends, and now I want to get more into Arthurian legends. And I've said that multiple times, and I still need to read Arthur and the Round Table, whatever that book is called. I have it and I'm terrified of it, but Arthurian, anything Arthurian, it's so cool, but I'm so intimidated. This next book was a warm hug. Oh, I loved it so much. Dr. Thorne by Anthony Trollope, and I am so happy that I loved this as much as I did because I didn't have as much success with Barchester Towers. I couldn't get past getting bogged down by the church politics. And honestly, I would say Barchester Towers has a more unique story than Dr. Thorne. This one was very predictable, just a typical romance in a sense, but I loved it so much. So this one is about a girl named Mary, and she lives with her paternal uncle, Dr. Thorne. She takes on his last name, Mary Thorne, and her parents, she doesn't quite know what happened to them, who they are. And Dr. Thorne is also the family physician for this, I guess, upper class family, the Greshams, and they're falling on hard times financially, and they're trying to get their son, Frank, married off to a wealthy woman. But Frank has a crush on Mary, and the story goes from there. So it's honestly nothing all that unique, but I didn't care. I loved it, and the characters were they were perfect. Dr. Thorne was a teddy bear, and I wanted to just give him a hug. He actually reminds me so much of my uncle. I have an uncle who is very much like another father figure in my life, and he just reminded me so much of him. I loved it. I enjoyed it so much, and I really loved Anthony Trollope's writing. So I'm so excited to continue with the Barsetshire series. I have 3 more books to get through, and I can't wait to read those ones as well. I heard they get better and better, so very, very excited. I love this so much. This next book is hands down one of my favorite Victorian classics of all time. I went in expecting to have a good time. I didn't expect to fall in love with this story quite as much as I did, and I'm talking about Deerbrook by Harriet Martineau. This book was so good. Okay, on the surface, because you really should not know what I knew going into this book, and I knew what's written on the back, and it spoils things. It's so stupid. Why do classics do this? Why? So just know that this book inspired Elizabeth Gaskell in her writing, Charlotte Bronte in her writing. It was an early Victorian book. And the author, Harriet Martineau, was one of the first female sociologists, if not the first female sociologist, a very intelligent woman, and she created very complex characters in this book. She did such a good job. And basically the story is about 2 sisters that are orphaned. They are in their early 20s and they move to this country village. They grew up in the city, but they moved to this village, and they move in with their distant relatives, the Grey family. And while living with the Greys, they meet various people, a few of whom are potential love interests, and things get a little complicated. Honestly, this book is like a Victorian Jane Austen book. Like if Jane Austen wrote during the Victorian time, it's like that, but less witty, less funny. There are bits of humor throughout the story, and there are these kids in the story that bring so much levity when it's needed. The kids were hilarious. There were so many moments where I laughed, like authentically laughed out loud. They were so precious. The way that the family structure is portrayed in this book, and just family in general, was so beautiful. And you could have plopped me in this book and I would have felt like I get what they're dealing with in this book. I get what these sisters are dealing with. It's relatable in a way, even though I haven't gone exactly through what they're going through. The character work is amazing. The sister relationship between the 2 is wow. Like I said, it is like a Jane Austen novel, but less funny and with more philosophizing, is that a word? You get what I'm trying to say. And the themes in this book are 100% relevant to our current day and age. There are riots, there's gossip, and there's a little quote here at the top of the back, and it says, "If you do a thing which a village public does not approve, there will be offense in whatever else you say and do for some time after." And that quote reflects one of the characters and what they have to go through, and basically like mob mentality, and how that literally can ruin a person's life because, you know, they happen to vote for the wrong person and people find out, and, you know, all hell breaks loose, so to speak. It is a slower book. You're really just doing life with these characters, but it is precious, and you want to do life with these characters because they feel real and they're so interesting. And there was one scene where the kids are making a tea party. They're setting up a tea party for the adults, and it was just so precious. They make tea out of this cowslip flour, and the adults like pretend to drink it. They don't really want to drink it. And then it starts pouring rain and things get very entertaining very fast. So it's just like little things like that are throughout the novel that make it funny, even though the novel itself is not comedic in general. If you have not read this book and you love classics, please read it. The next 2 books I don't have physical copies of because I lent them out to people to read, which I literally said I don't do. I don't lend my books out, but I made exceptions because I loved both of these books. They were both 5 stars and I want people to read them. The first one here is The Hidden Prince by Tessa Afshar. This was exactly what I was expecting, but it still was a 5-star read. Like I expected it to be amazing, and it was. So in The Hidden Prince, we have a character named Karen, and she is a distant relative of Daniel. Her family has fallen on hard times. Daniel takes her into his house and she works as a scribe. She also takes lessons in like swordsmanship and things like that with the tutor of Daniel's children, as well as a friend of Daniel's kids. And so they're all just taking these lessons together. Karen is unfortunately involved in an accident and she has to flee because she's scared for her life. So she ends up in another city, and there she's tasked with tutoring this shepherd boy, and there's rumors that he is someone much greater than he believes he is. He thinks he's just a shepherd boy. He doesn't even know what the rumors are. And so Karen figures out who he is, and she's tasked with tutoring him. He is a character in the Bible. It was just so cool to see how everything unfolded and figuring out who he is and how he plays a role in biblical events. It was just really, really cool. Karen does have a love interest, and he ends up following her when she escapes, and he was involved in what had happened back in Babylon. And he is dealing with some heartache and everything, and they're just both dealing with stuff. And so he follows her, and they just like work together in this other city. And then he finds out who this kid is, and he works even harder to protect both him and Karen. And I honestly made the story sound terrible. It is so good. If you've never read biblical fiction before, but you're interested, I highly recommend trying out a Tessa Afshar book. She's great. The other book that I don't have my copy of right now is Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. I think it's safe to say this is my new favorite YA fantasy ever. It was beautiful. This one is about two young journalists, and it's in a world that feels very much inspired by England during the World War I era, the 1910s. And the gods in this land are at war with each other, and so the World War I feel is very much there, but it's gods warring with each other. And we have two main characters. We have Iris and Roman, and they're both working for this gazette. Iris's brother is fighting at the front lines, and to, I guess, cope with the fact that she doesn't know what's going on with him, she writes letters to him, but she just slips them beneath her wardrobe, obviously not expecting them to get anywhere. But she realizes that they are disappearing. She just doesn't know where they're going. And they're actually going to Roman, who is her arch nemesis, basically, at this gazette that they're working at. But this back and forth with them sending letters to each other and her not realizing that it's him, but him knowing it's her, it really forces them into this special connection, so to speak. It sounded interesting when I first got it, and I thought it sounded cute. I was not ready for how precious and whimsical this book actually was. I also want a typewriter. This book really made me want to go buy a typewriter. All right, and I have two more books to talk about. One of them was the 4-star read, and then I have one final 5-star. So we have A Beauty So Rare and A Note Yet Unsung by Tamara Alexander. I've mentioned many times already over the last few months that I am rereading my Tamara Alexander books. This one's about a woman named Eleanor who has dreams to open up, I guess, like a restaurant and cook for people, but she is from money and higher class society in Nashville, and her aunt, Adelicia Acklin, who owns Belmont Mansion, is very much against her doing this and wants her to get married, basically. But Eleanor really fights for her dream of helping people who are less fortunate. And then we have the love interest, who is actually the Archduke of Austria. So he is heir to the throne, but he is just sick and tired of his life in Europe. So he came to America to work as an architect, and he meets Eleanor and sparks fly. I know I've said before that I need a break from like Christian romance, and they all feel the same, and honestly they do. But Tamara Alexander just has such a special touch with her stories. She always imbues her stories with so much more than just a superficial romance, and there are amazing side characters that add so much depth to the story. But even the main love interests, they have a lot of depth to their own characters. The Archduke Marcus, he actually has a green thumb, and he's working in the greenhouse on the Belmont Mansion estate. And so this book is full of botany, cooking, like just everything, art. It's just beautiful. I will say there are trigger warnings for dementia, asylums, as Eleanor's father does have dementia, and it was quite tragic. But the way that was represented in this book was done so well. I personally just didn't love the romance as much, and I didn't really connect to the characters. So it was a 4-star read for me, not quite 5, but still a really great book. And then finally we have A Note Yet Unsung, and in this one we have Rebecca, who is a violinist. She is an amazing musician, but it is the 1800s, and at the time women were not allowed to play in orchestras. She tries to audition for the Nashville Orchestra, doesn't get a place, but she ends up working as some sort of assistant to the conductor of the orchestra, the director. And his name is Nathaniel, and he's really struggling to finish composing the symphony that they are to play when the new opera house is finished, I guess as like the grand opening. And he has Rebecca helping with just like transcribing for different instruments and things like that, and writing out sheet music. Nate has a very special reason as to why he is so stressed about finishing this symphony and who he is writing it for, and it really tugged at my heartstrings. It was very precious. He comes from very humble beginnings, and so Rebecca kind of figures that out and follows him, and there's a bit of forced proximity at some times. Rebecca also has some trauma in her past, as her mother remarried after her father passed away, and the man that she remarried made disgusting advances towards Rebecca as well, and she's just trying to get away from that toxic environment. And there's a lot in this book, and I loved it so much. I honestly also just adore classical music, and the last few chapters made me tear up, like just how beautiful they were. But also Nate has some struggles with his health, and things are affecting his ability to compose, and that just really, really broke my heart. So good. Highly recommend. Just Tamara Alexander in general. She does no wrong in my eyes. All right, that was a lot. But those were the very many stories, books, poetry, plays, whatever, that I read in May. I'm not sure I will ever read this much in a month again, and I don't think I want to because it kind of hurt my head, but I'm really grateful for the bed rest. I really needed it. Anyways, if any of you made it to the end of the video, you are amazing, and I don't blame anyone who didn't. But if you did, leave a book emoji, bookish emoji in the comments below. And that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. And I will see you all in my next video, whenever that is, because life is crazy and you never know. But I will see you all in my next video. Bye.